always, now, as always, this is the time in which we are trying. So if anyone is already connected, please be patient. We are now going live streaming on YouTube on our channel, and welcome everyone. I am looking to see if Nuno can confirm that
We are live.
we are live. Very good. Okay, it's working. So welcome everyone, and we it's now 1 minute past half, so we can wait a little bit more and give, as always, more or less 5 minutes time for everyone to join. Okay, so be patient, and we will start in for 5 minutes. Okay, again, we are waiting. If you are joining now, we are all silent because we are waiting, as always, a couple of minutes so people can join us, and we will start more or less at, you know 6:35, as always, with our lecture, giving 5 minutes time for everyone to join. I am now checking on our YouTube channel. Still a couple of minutes before we start. If you are joining now, welcome. We are almost ready to go. We are waiting a couple of minutes to give the time for everyone to join, but you are on the right place. We are just starting in a few minutes. Okay, so Nuno, let's see, it's 5 past our time. Maybe we can start, right? As always. And while we are introducing, maybe more people will join, right? So I am going to start rather slowly so we can have the time for people to connect. But in the meanwhile, we can more or less keep going. So we are on time with our lecture today. So, okay. So, dear all, a very warm welcome to this 8th lecture in our Radical Environmental Humanities series with Professor Stefania Barca. My name is Mark Carmiero, and I am the editor-in-chief of Resistance, a journal of Radical Environmental Humanities. And I'm coordinating this lecture, this series of lecture actually, with Lizzie Privitera from the University of Toronto and Nuno Marquez from KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. This lecture series is co-hosted by Resistance and the Institute for the History of Science at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Nuno will say a few words about the lecture series, while I will take a moment to introduce our journal, and Lizzie will introduce Stefania, our guest, in a moment. At this moment, our lectures have reached more than 1,800 people. 1,800 people. Evidently, ideas for resistance are highly needed at this moment, I guess. So Resistance is a relatively new journal, previously titled Resilience. I changed its name when I became editor-in-chief to reflect a new intellectual and political agenda. While Resistance focuses on enduring stresses and returning to a prior state, Resistance is more about fighting back and changing the conditions that causes the crisis. Our aim as Resistance is to become a reference point for radical scholarship in environmental humanities. If you are wondering what is radical in environmental humanities, here is our working definition. I am quoting from our website. Radical environmental humanities include any approach that questions the current state of society and academia, stands in solidarity with grassroots movements and oppressed subjects, and contributes to research fostering more just socio-ecological relationships. I believe our commitment to resist and build another world aligns quite well with our guests' words, reflecting on the lives and deaths of Claudia and Maria, two workers and activists living in the Amazon. Stefania Barca writes, and I'm quoting from her book, interspecies commoners like Maria and Claudio have developed significant potential for resisting species supremacy and the degradation of Earth systems that comes with it. The potential is key to subvert the master system. In fact, species supremacy must be seen as a key feature of capitalist industrial modernity, which could collapse without it. That interspecies commoning resonates with anti-master thinking and activism beyond the global south, more specifically with ecofeminism. I would suggest that this resonance speaks today to today labor's environmentalism in important ways, pointing towards the possibility of thinking of non-human nature as co-constitute of labor subject rather than its author, and organizing workers beyond the wage relation, struggling for radically anti-master relations with Earth. And this is the end of the quote from Stefania's book, Workers of the Earth. We are in debt with Stefania's thinking for our quest for radicality. And now I give the floor to Nuno to introduce the series.
Thank you, Marco. Hello, everyone. So I'm Nuno Marques. I'm a member of Resistance, and my work is very simple. I just want to introduce the lecture series. I'm here also to help moderate the Q&A with Lizzie. Please write your questions, comments, ideas on the YouTube chat, and we will make sure that Stefania gets them. This lecture today is the 9th one in the series on radical environmental humanities that has been taking place once a month since last year and will go until next month. Resistance brings together a community of radical scholars to share ideas, stories, and dreams for the world we need. With this lecture series, we aim to contribute to the collective quest to reinvent and reenact radical environmental humanities. Our ambition is to create a community of practices and solidarity rather than a fixed canon, because for us, radicality is always a quest, a horizon, a collective and unresolved question about ourselves and our commitment to change the world. And we are happy to have had such incredible speakers, and Stefania today, and next month, the last speaker, which will be Raul Zibecki on June 25. You are all invited to join the next month's lecture. You can also find the lecture program with detailed information in the Facebook page of the Resistance Journal and at the webpage of the Institute for the History of Science at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Thank you. So now I'll give the floor to Lizzie.
Thank you, Nuno. Thank you, Marco. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Lizzie Ritera. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Toronto, and I'm a member of the collective at Resistance Journal. I am here to introduce today's speaker, Professor Stefania Barca, and help to moderate the Q&A. So Stefania Barca is a senior Beatriz Galindo Distinguished Researcher in the Department of History at the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. She worked as a senior researcher at the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra in Portugal from 2009 to 2021. There, she held various research leadership roles and supervised doctoral and postdoctoral research. Previously, she was a visiting researcher at the Agrarian Studies program at the Yale University between 2005 and 2006 and held a Cyber Wontrop postdoc at the University of Berkeley. Between 2015 and 16, she was a visiting professor at the University of Lund, and more recently, she was a Zenstrom Professor in Climate Change Leadership at Uppsala University. Her research interest lies in environmental history and political ecology with a focus on the industrial era. She has researched hydropower and the making of industrial landscapes between the 18th and the 20th centuries, and environmental mobilization, especially peasant mobilization, indigenous workers, both in Italy, Brazil, and Portugal, from the 1960s to the present. She's currently investigating the just transition topic from a feminist perspective with a special attention to care work. She has published widely in peer-reviewed international journals, and her latest book is Workers of the Earth, Labor, Ecology, and Reproduction in the Age of Climate Change, published in 2024 by Pluto Press. Among her other notable books are also In Crossing Water, Nature and Political Economy in the Mediterranean Valley, published by White Horse Press in 2010, which received the Turku Book Prize in 2011, and the short book Force of Reproduction, Notes for a Counter-Hegemonic Anthropocene, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. She's active in feminist, climate justice, and the growth network, and her work has been translated and disseminated in several languages. Before we begin, please submit your comments and questions on our Facebook page or YouTube channel during the talk. Nuno and I and Marco will share your questions during the Q&A session. So thank you again for your attention. Stefania, the floor is yours. And when you want, I share the PowerPoint.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Lizzie, for the introduction, and Marco and Nuno as well, for introducing the series, and also for inviting me to contribute to this fantastic lineup of talks in and about resistance, or also the radical environmental humanities. So I want to contribute to this discussion from a specific standpoint, that of labor, by which I mean both waged and unwaged workers engaged in industrial, but also meta-industrial work, which is domestic work and subsistence work. And also from a distinct time frame, which is the last 7 decades of Anthropocene history, the so-called Great Acceleration era. This is the topic of my latest book that Lizzie was mentioning before, Workers of the Earth, which stems from research and political work that I have developed over the past 20 years, from early explorations into the environmental history and political ecology of work to my personal engagement with the politics of ecofeminism, degrowth, Green New Deal, and just transition. So, Lizzie, I will be asking you to please move on to the next slide. Thank you. So let's start with the time frame. The Great Acceleration is the name given by a group of scientists that were led by the late Bill Stephan through the now extinct IGBP, International Geosphere Biosphere Program, to the period of human history from 1950 to 2010, and by extension to the present time. The reason for using this term, Great Acceleration, becomes very evident by a simple glimpse at the historical data that supported this claim, that you can see in these graphics. Although most of the indicators of Earth system degradation were already in motion in the late 18th century, the epoch of the Industrial Revolution, with its correlated shift from organic energy to fossil energy, all of these indicators of Earth system degradation show a marked exponential increase in the post-World War II period from approximately from the year 1950. This coincides with the era of growth, intended not simply as the exponential growth of GDP globally, of course, with enormous inequalities on regional and national scales, but perhaps even more importantly, this coincides with the era in which GDP growth has become the undisputable criterion of every political decision, including environmental and climate decisions. Now, in my previous book, Forces of Reproduction, I have described this dominance of growth-centered decision-making in environmental politics. I have described it as eco-capitalist realism, by which I mean the ideology that there is no alternative to capitalist solutions to the ecological crisis. This is the ideology that informs neoliberal climate governance on the global scale. It rests on a powerful hegemonic narrative of environmental change that hides the perspective, the agency, and the very existence of labor and of workers, all kinds of workers. For example, with all its apparent objectivity and impressive capacity of big data management, the great acceleration graphics completely omit to report on how human labor has evolved in this period. Its increased depletion and exhaustion of workers in the process of accelerating the production of both commodities and of humans themselves, because the graphics also start from population growth, demographic growth. So this is the cheap labor force that was needed for growing GDP, population, and somebody had to make it. As if labor did not matter in accomplishing the exponential increase of all the socioeconomic indicators represented here in these graphics, and as if workers and human life more broadly were not affected by the correlated increase in consequent Earth system degradation. In contrast, my book builds on the view that workers are to be seen as an ecological subject, by which I mean actors of environmental change in all possible senses, whose agency develops in the context of and in response to specific labor regimes, property relations, sexual and racial divisions of labor. In short, labor is a primary agent of social metabolism, who, paraphrasing Marx, makes its own relationship with external nature, although in conditions not of its choosing. Within this broad context, I am particularly interested in those cases in which workers' ecological agency becomes explicitly politicized as labor environmentalism. I ask, what conditions make this happen? How do different stories of labor environmentalism differ among each other? And what do they have in common? And what conditions limit or enhance the potentialities of labor environmentalism? These are the kind of questions that I ask in the book. My interest is not purely academic, though. Having witnessed it in my lifetime, decades of increasing global warming following the development of carbon markets and green growth since the 90s, I am fully convinced that ecological sustainability will never trickle down from neoliberal climate governance. Further, I am convinced that, like most of social change in the last 2 centuries, so real change in ecological and climate matters will have to come from workers' struggles. Again, by workers including both the waged and the unwaged of the world. This is why we need to ask, how do workers' ecological struggles form and how can they succeed? What alliances are needed to support them? How can science help in strengthening workers' ecological power, not only the natural and art sciences, but also the human and the social sciences? And here it is that the radical environmental humanities come in. Nothing less than our future depends on the answers to these questions. Please, next slide. Thank you. So first of all, we need to ask the question, what is labor? We need to ask this question again in the 21st century because past understandings of what labor is have been limited by gender and racial and even species supremacy. And this has limited labor's political potential. This is one of my main points in the book. Here we enter the terrain of decolonial and feminist critiques of historical materialism, a very rich scholarship that since several decades now has helped expand and complexify the notions of class and of labor beyond stereotypical images of the white male blue-collar waged worker in high-tech sectors producing industrial commodities. This, as it is now abundantly clear, form only a small minority of the global working classes, which, as the ILO itself tells us, the International Labour Organization who has produced the data that I'm showing here, the global working classes are made for 45% of unwaged work, mostly care work, and women and girls form around 75% of this unpaid or unwaged work. This figure tells us that, first of all, almost half of human labor, of all human labor, is not accounted for by the GDP measure of wealth because it is unpaid. Second, this devalued labor is gendered. And third, most reproductive work is freely appropriated by the global economy to sustain its growth, primarily via the provision of a cheap labor force, but also via subsistence production and non-monetized services provided to both people and the environment. Now, none of this is visible in the great acceleration charts. This helps us understand labor as the ensemble of waged and unwaged, industrial and meta-industrial, or else care, domestic and subsistence workers, as part of a globally interconnected subject, which, with all its internal differentiations, is fundamentally other than capital. This otherness, I believe, must be defended by any means possible, so that something different, a different mode of humanity, to use an expression from Val Plumwood, can shape our future on Earth. The neoliberal narrative of environmental and climate crisis makes this otherness completely invisible, or rather, it denies it. It wants us to believe that there is only one humanity in which the slave is one with the master. This is why my research and political agenda over the past decade has focused on fleshing out all the different dimensions of labor's anti-master potential, not only within, but also outside the wage relation, not only as a force of production, holding the power of stopping, changing, reorienting the production of commodities towards different ends, but also as a force of reproduction, holding the power of stopping the production of labor power, changing the conditions for the reproduction of capital, and reorienting them towards other ends. This is the power held within reproductive and subsistence work. Without it, no labor struggle can ultimately succeed, and real change cannot come about. Next slide, please. So my first investigations into the environmental history of work led me to theorize three analytical levels through which the environmental agency of labor could be grasped. And here I'm entering in the first part of the book named History, in which these historiographical and also historical case studies are collected. So the first level is what I call landscapes, the level of landscapes as understood as past human labor. This chapter opens the book by problematizing simplistic narratives which blame environmental degradation on the destroying effect of human labor, while pitting conservation against the interests of workers. Inspired by Raymond Williams' essay, Ideas of Nature, which argued that each landscape embodies a varied amount of human labor, and seeing or not seeing it is a political choice, I interrogate the environmental history of a number of places in search for the human labor that had shaped them under regimes of agrarian capitalism, fascist autarky, colonialism, slavery, and international trade. The stories collected here show how each landscape, as Marx had already pointed out, resulted from the correlated exploitation of both human labor and of the soil. At the same time, these cases also show how capitalist contradictions shape the environments where working class people live and the specific ways in which they experience ecology, what I call the ecology of working class communities, characterized by occupational hazards and public health disasters correlated with industrial accidents, as well as with the slow violence of petrochemicals, radioactivity, asbestos, and innumerable other forms of industrial contamination that accumulate in working class bodies and places. In short, by environmental inequalities. However, working class ecologies are not only characterized by distinct forms of exploitation and risk, but also by specific forms of resistance opposed by workers against the degradation of nature and of their own bodies as part of nature, a resistance that in some important cases was organized through powerful and successful union struggles, such as those for workers' control and the regulation of hazardous substances in both manufacturing and in farming, as well as the struggle for community agroforestry and conservation in the Amazon region. Next slide, please. So, and here we come from the theory to the stories. My interest for the environmental history of labor had originated from a casual encounter with the story of this man, Nicola Lovecchio, an Italian petrochemical worker who had mobilized for the recognition of industrial hazards in the town of Manfredonia, Apulia, after a serious accident had occurred in 1976, which had caused widespread contamination by arsenic acid over the entire population and landscape, affecting also farmers and fishers. What had stricken me of that story was its complete absence from both social and environmental narratives of post-war Italy. none of which seemed capable of accounting for working class experiences of environmental problems. Next slide. That story led me to investigate trade unions' mobilizations against noxiousness or toxicity, as industrial hazards were called in the Italian labor movement in the late 1960s and 1970s, exemplified by the intense period of struggles for workers' right to direct control over the health and safety in the work environment. These struggles, I learned, were already well known to historians of occupational medicine in Europe and elsewhere, but environmental historians had paid no attention to them. But perhaps more importantly, the story of Manfredonia led me to make another discovery. It taught me that working class ecologies are shaped by the agency of working class women in important ways, even when they are unwaged workers, domestic workers. An agency which was even more invisible than that of industrial workers. So I learned from the women of Manfredonia, who were the first to organize collective action for reclaiming justice against the state company that had caused the disaster, bringing their case all the way up to the European Court for Human Rights. Next slide, please. More recently, I discovered another story of working class women's environmental agency. This is the story of the opposition against the third nuclear reactor of Hinkley C in Somerset, UK, a battle led by one of the most iconic of all working class women's movements, the Wages for Housework campaign in the late 1980s. Again, this was an untold story, unaccounted for in both labor and environmental narratives. Why so? And what were we missing by obliterating the struggles of unpaid domestic and care workers like the women of Manfredonia and Bristol in this case, against none less than the petrochemical and nuclear industries, probably the two most powerful industrial sectors of the Great Acceleration era? What these stories showed me was the environmental subjectivity, not of women as such, a category which I always found rather problematic and even contradictory, but more specifically of working class women, and to be very precise, of unpaid reproductive workers. Next slide, please. The unrecognition of domestic labor as an environmental subject can be paired with the unrecognition of another invisible labor subject, and this is the subject of peasant and indigenous subsistence work. Like most of domestic work, subsistence is also typically unwaged, and this condition hides its relevance to social and environmental reproduction, as well as its potential for social change. Probably the most important story I have learned by investigating the ecologies of labor in the Great Acceleration era is the story of the RISEX, the community agroforestry protected areas recognized by the Brazilian constitution, by Brazilian law in 1990, after more than a decade of struggles on the part of Brazil's peasant, indigenous, and rural union movements, known as the Alliance of Forest Peoples. Started in the late 1970s under the leadership of rubber tapped unionist Chico Mendes, together with indigenous leader Ailton Krenak and others, that struggle had a truly revolutionary character, I argue, insofar as it was driven by principles of interspecies commoning, that is, the historical culture and practices of indigenous peasant, mestizo, and Afro-descendant communities of former slaves that is an anti-master subsistence workers' way of relating to the land and to non-human nature. Next slide, please. So building on these stories of industrial, domestic, and subsistence workers' resistance against environmental degradation, in the second part of the book, I collect some more contemporary political reflections on the political ecology of labor as developed by the labor movements and institutions of the neoliberal era, in both dialogue with and conflict with other movements, and particularly with the degrowth movement and with ecofeminists. Much of this discussion focuses on the concept of just transition, which originates from labor struggles against industrial toxicity in the 1970s, but is now being remade through different pathways into a completely different concept. We can go more in detail on that if you're interested in the discussion. Next slide, please. Another issue discussed in this second part of the book is the relationship between eco-socialism and degrowth. Here, my main contribution to the debate consisted in arguing that the degrowth movement had lacked a reflection on the political subjectivity in the capitalist system, a lacuna that was not secondary. Even the revolutionary character of the degrowth vision, which lacking a revolutionary subject remains, to me, remained trapped into impossible dichotomies between utopian planning and minoritarian escapist practices. My proposal is that to develop its own revolutionary subject, the degrowth movement needs to learn from and incorporate different dimensions of labor and working class ecology. Next slide, please. Finally, I address the issue of ecomodernism, or the labor's version of ecomodernism, what I call labor's eco-modernist dilemma, by developing a genealogy of how this came to dominate the trade union movement and divide the eco-Marxist debate in the course of the last quarter of the 20th century, which is the time in which, coinciding with the rise and consolidation of the neoliberal environmental agenda in the global north. My analysis in this chapter focuses on 4 Marxist intellectuals of Western Europe who were deeply influential in shaping different strands of red-green politics. The British eco-socialist Raymond Williams, the Italian communist politician and ecologist Laura Conti, the French writer and first proponent of degrowth André Gortz, and the German ecofeminist Maria Mies. My main point here is that labor's eco-modernist agenda emerges from a gradual exclusion of the perspective of unwaged subsistence work, and that exclusion has seriously limited the leadership of labor in environmental politics and the possibility for social alliances within the global climate justice movement, even though new developments such as climate jobs campaigns and Green New Deal campaigns have been partially countering that historical tendency. Next, please. And so we get to the epilogue of the book, where I make a proposal on how to radicalize the just transition strategy by fully incorporating care work as a climate job. This idea builds upon my own work within the Green New Deal for Europe campaign back in 2019, and within the Care Income campaign from 2020 onward, and more recently, my active involvement with the International Just Transition and Care Network and its demands for a just transition centered on the perspectives and needs of carers, including both paid and unpaid workers in domestic labor, community work, community care, healthcare, environmental protection, and education. My hope with this campaign is for radicalizing the just transition agenda via a global alliance of care and subsistence workers with industrial workers to get rid of eco-capitalist realism once and for all. And I think I will conclude here and be happy to hear your questions or thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefania, for this fantastic talk. A lot of questions from my side, but let's, as always, first of all, see if there is already any comment on or question on YouTube, and also on Facebook. We are Lizzie and myself we are monitoring our social media just to be sure that everyone has the possibility to ask a question or anyway to say something in this meeting. But maybe while Nuno and Lizzie, if you are on top of this situation, I can maybe start as always with some questions myself, so then we can give a little bit more for people to think. So Stefania, I have a question, maybe a couple of questions. One is maybe, I don't know, maybe it's a curiosity in a sense. But many times when I am talking about these kind of things and, referring always to your work, actually, I say something and now I am not sure if I am right or wrong. Because what I say all often is that environmental history is not very aware of the situation. Or generally, my comment is that environmental history textbooks, in the environmental history textbooks, we will find John Muir, we will find Aldo Leopold, but many times we will not find Chico Mendes or, Cesar Chavez. But to tell you the truth, I am now wondering, is it possible that I am a little bit, how can I say, thinking about something that was in the past, but maybe it changed? I know very well, I know your work. We can mention maybe Chris Sellers, another person that has been very influential, another scholar, that Chad Montry has written a lot on this. But I am not sure how much these, I don't know, like monographic books have been translated in the textbooks. Would you be able to comment on this? What is your impression? I am a little bit not very generous with our colleagues and things have changed, or do you think that is still a little bit like that? With more research going on, but maybe not so much in the teaching phase, so textbooks basically.
Yeah, well, I think that to begin with, there aren't so many, very many environmental history textbooks that I know of. There are some. There are some also collections, environmental history series or collections of edited volumes. I think that labor can be found, or work, at least as a concept in environmental history, can be found in some of these collections. It's not a prominent topic. The prominent topics are more on the side of the history of conservation and all the debates around various kinds of conservation. So this is definitely true. But there are also, well, in the first chapter of the book, I do a kind of literature review of the literature in environmental history in the English language mostly, that take in labor and work into account. So there are a number of scholars who have done that. But I would say that, yeah, you're probably correct in saying that this hasn't probably has not made it into the mainstream narrative of environmental history, probably. Even though, of course, we should also look at what is happening in different contexts, in different languages. This is also always true, no? But I think that there has been, since the beginning of environmental history, a sharp preference for looking at what the natural sciences were saying about environmental change, and not so much to what the social sciences were saying. But this has been countered by a number of scholars, and there are also political ecologists who take a more historical approach and tell us stories that we can learn, even though they come from human geography, other disciplines. So it's important to be transdisciplinary or undisciplined if we want to study this topic, no?
Thank you. I understood that I need to be a little bit more careful. This is what I understood. And I agree with you that maybe there is this Anglophone empire, no? It would be interesting to know from our friends from Brazil, Latin America, other kind of language context, what is happening. So thank you for this. Lizzie and Nuno, I am always looking at you because I don't want to monopolize the discussion. So I don't know if there is anything that is going on our social media. I am trying to follow on Facebook, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't see anything going on in terms of questions. So maybe if you have anything, please interrupt me. Otherwise, maybe the other question I was thinking, Stefania, to ask you is, do you see in this moment the possibility or even the reality of alliances between unions, working class, environmentalism, unions, and the left? Because when you are telling the stories that you have mentioned, I am thinking about the Italian case, Manfredonia, but also the extractivist reserves in Brazil, Chico Mendes, the climate jobs, and so on and so forth. But I am wondering, is yes, I see that there is also a question, but so just very quickly, I wonder, those alliances are invisibilized and we don't talk about it. They are basically we don't tell their stories, but they are going on also now. Or do you think that it's a moment in which we don't see a lot of these alliances going on? It's a matter of making them visible, or is actually that we don't have a lot of these alliances, as I said, going on?
Well, Marco, this is a crucial point at this moment in history when, with the rise of the extreme right in several countries, and trade unions are dividing along different positions with regards to it. For example, in the US, one of the main industrial trade unions has aligned themselves with Trump. So we have to, one of the points I make in one of the chapters, the one regarding the labor's eco-modernist dilemma. What I mean by dilemma, the eco-modernist dilemma, what I mean by it is that we are used to think about labor versus environmental movements as two homogeneous blocks. But what we need to realize that they are not homogeneous, not only environmentalism there are different forms of environmentalism, and more radical, less radical, or more right-wing or left-wing, but this also applies to the labor organizations and trade unions themselves. Trade unions are not a monolithic hegemonic bloc. They are divided and they take different positions regarding environmental politics and politics in general. So we shouldn't conflate the trade unions movement with the left as such, right? So it is important to see this because there are also, it's not just a matter of political orientation, it's also a matter of different kinds of unions. There are the national and international confederations, there are grassroots union or even social movement unionism, all grassroots union groups that form in different situations regarding different issues, sometimes in open opposition versus the trade unions confederation. So it's important to see all these conflicts going on within the camp of organized labor to understand what is going on there and the kind of politics that are to be supported in view of building an alliance with the rest of the climate justice movement, and the kind of politics that are not. For example, one of the examples that I mentioned in the chapters on degrowth and eco-socialism, one of the cases is when there was the Keystone pipeline controversy in the US. There were some of the trade unions that aligned themselves with, again, with Trump first administration and with the building of the pipeline against the indigenous and local communities that were opposing it. Other unions, for example, the nurses union, were strong, or the teachers unions were strongly supporting the indigenous communities and opposition to the pipeline. So it's important to see also this also clearly depends on what kind of labor is being affected by what kind of politics, no? So this is all very complicated, but it's important if we want to navigate these labor and environmental politics, we need to see these differences and to consider this also inequalities within the very labor camp.
Thank you. No, maybe there is something, right? Stefania, can you see the chat? Otherwise, we can read it for you. There's a question from Josie.
Yes. Reading it now.
For those who are not on our teams, Josie is asking, could you say a little more about the wages for housework campaign, the criticism it has received, and the dilemmas surrounding it? Thank you, Josie.
Okay, thank you, Josie. This would be a topic for an entirely, what happened? Okay, for an entirely different talk. I will try to focus on specifically on the aspects of the campaign that I see more related to environmental politics, because the wages for housework, very briefly, is one of the historically one of the most important movements regarding organizing for around unpaid domestic work, for the rights of unpaid domestic workers who happen to be mostly women, but not just women, mostly working class, peasant, indigenous, and racialized women, migrant women, for example. No, I mean, these are the subjects that do most of the unpaid domestic work in the world, and the data from ILO that I showed before confirms that. So this movement was born in the 70s to make a political point that domestic work was work, and not only that, but as work, it needed to be compensated, to be paid for. And the point of the campaign was for the state, not the market, the state to recognize that this work, this domestic work, is actually contributing to the growth of the economy. And so as such, it deserves to be recognized and to be compensated, and also to get all the benefits of waged work. So, for example, a pension fund or vacations, to all the labor rights that other kinds of workers, of waged workers, enjoy or should enjoy. So, I see this movement as a sort of social movement, unionism, in the sense that this is a kind of a movement that defends the rights of unpaid workers, but as workers. So, and it does so in a form that is more similar to that of a social movement than the form of a trade union, no? But still, I think this is a social movement that is a labor movement, can be seen as a labor movement, making an important point. And to me, what is even more important is the fact that this movement has endorsed a number historically, because the campaign was launched back in the 1970s, but the movement has continued its struggles for the past 50 years, and it's still struggling around a number of issues, not just the wages for housework. Now it's renamed as Global Women's Strike, and it's what was really important to understand was that they have seen. Back in the 80s, they saw the nuclear risk, radioactive risk, and nuclear power controversy as a women's issue from the point of view of unpaid domestic work, because they made the point that radioactivity and radioactive risk was an additional burden of care work and responsibility falling upon the shoulders of working class and racialized women of the Bristol inner urban area of Bristol. So that was a very original, important point, and very similar to other struggles that urban environmental justice struggles led by women that also mobilized the motherhood, not as an essentialist claim, but as a claim of claiming that motherhood is a form of labor, and that mothers do a lot of work that is unrecognized, unpaid, and that is affected by environmental risk, not only radioactive risk, all sorts of extractivism and all sorts of environmental risk associated with it. So they were making this important point that if the state in making its decisions in energy politics towards implementing nuclear energy, if the state were accounting for the burden of unpaid care work that would come with radioactive risk, and if the state were accounting for the real cost in monetary terms, the real cost of this burden of work, then it would have become clear that the nuclear power was not economically sustainable, right? So the whole, and this not only applies to nuclear power, this applies to the whole extractive industries and fossil energy and fossil industries and everything that is harming in the environment and public health, because it can only appear as economically profitable because a lot of things, not only domestic work, but also domestic work, are discounted because they are not paid, because they are appropriated for free, extracted for free from the state and from society at large. So only by not paying these domestic and other forms of care work can these big industries become profitable and economically sustainable. So I think this is a very original and important point made by the movement, which I think is something very relevant to political ecologists and to environmental historians as well.
Thank you, Stefania. Thank you, Giusy. Lizzy, maybe, right?
Yeah, yeah, I can. Can you hear me? Sorry, it's a bit, I'm in a noisy place, so I hope you can hear me. So I thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting, and I'm very curious about many things, but perhaps I can share two key or kind of curiosity I have, and I want to take advantage of your knowledge about that. So our first question is more about if you can articulate more about how the rising of super right-wing and conservative political movements worldwide at different levels is already impacted, could potentially impact more and more all the factory struggle for having recognized the unpaid domestic work and workers. If you a bit mentioned actually, but if you can articulate a bit on that, we'd be very curious to see your opinion about this. And then I do have another totally different question, but I'm very curious about all the topic debates that currently you have with artificial intelligence and all of that. And I think there is a couple aspects that are not entirely explored in academia so far, and the political debate even more, is both the ecological aspect underpinning of the AI, as well as the working aspect. So we do talk about it, but I think it's not enough and explored. Do you have any, I don't know, any idea to share, or any, I don't know, research or things you've been finding so far about the potential impact of AI in the way it will become very present in our daily life? How it's going to impact both the ecological aspect, the working aspect, and especially the mix between the two? And I would say even at the caring work, in which way is going to impact the care workers, for instance, and all the rights related around that. So it's a bit, I acknowledge that it's a very big question, but I kind of would like to hear your opinion about that. And thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Lizzy, these are very important questions. I am afraid I don't have the answers, but these are very good questions for further research. And especially, I'm mostly a historian, so I have been looking mostly at the past. So I don't really have new elements of what is going on right at the moment in AI. Although something I've been really interested in is to see one campaign I've encountered. This is not in my research. This is most by simply reading stuff. One campaign I've encountered is from Microsoft workers who have contested the use of Microsoft AI technology in Israel's military actions in Gaza. And so I think this is really, really important that workers from Microsoft themselves, they are themselves raising concerns on the use of their work in genocidal action and in war more broadly. Also, the example of the dock workers in the port of Livorno, if I'm not mistaken, in Italy, who organized to oppose the shipment of arms from Italy to Israel is another example. I mean, I would call these kind of forms, these are minoritarian, but still very important forms of mobilization of workers against destructive business, that the business of death and ecocide or genocide. Historically, one example that has nothing to do with AI, but one important example is the Lucas Plan in the UK, where it was workers from aerospace industry that mobilized to they did grassroots plan of reconversion of the industry into producing from war into peace production, producing different, using their skills and technologies and machinery they had already to produce different kinds of things that were of social use. So these examples tell us that there is this potential, this capacity in workers, especially when they organize, to protest and resist the logic of the economic logic, no, the logic of the capitalist economy that production comes first and profit comes first. And this is very important. Contesting this logic is very important, not only for the peace movement, but also for the ecology movement, because for years, for decades now, we have been used to hear the discourse that environmental protection would come from economic growth, paradoxically, that the countries with the higher levels of wealth were also the countries that would implement the best environmental politics, and the richest you become, the more environmentalist you become. This is the narrative that we have been raised into, at least my generation. And we have heard this story repeated again and again, and this is very dangerous, because this is the logic that puts production and profit on top of everything else. You have to grow the economy first, and to grow the economy, anything that grows the economy is good, as long as the GDP rises. And once you reach a certain point of GDP growth, then you'll see these post-materialist values or whatever, no, these new environmental. So this is the narrative that we have been socialized into, and very dangerous narrative which has resulted in exponential increase in carbon emissions and in biodiversity loss over the past 3 decades. So I think that workers' resistance, to me, is by resisting to this logic that production and profit come first, we can, as workers, we can also resist not only war and genocide, but also environmental destruction. This is what I hope. The first part of the question, sorry, I forgot, what was it about?
Let me see it. I think not the you mean not the I1.
The first part, no, the first question.
Oh my gosh.
It was about the race, if the race of the far right is affecting.
Yeah. Oh yeah, in which way it's been affecting the historical battle and struggle that feminists and workers in general have done, and how it's going to affect, you think, in the future, given that you have the past.
Yeah, I'm just guessing here, but I would say that, of course, the first danger is the danger of democracy, no, and of losing the very possibility of unionizing, of organizing, of resisting, of doing, union work, because of course, even though unions are not perfect and have never been, and have made also lots of mistakes, but it is the only form that we have, the only possibility we have of organizing for workers' rights, labor's rights, and somehow resisting the power of capital. And so I think this is the first risk, that most important. And of course, there is also the point that some parts of the labor movement can see the far right as representing the interests of certain kinds of workers. This is something that is not a consequence. It's more like part of the process that has led to the rise of the extreme right over the past decades, no? That a number of sectors of the working classes in different contexts have started to see themselves as better represented by these far-right politics. So it is also, I think, very important that trade unions, confederations make clear position themselves politically, no, in this context, and this is part of the struggle, I would say, at this particular moment in history. So this is to say that, you know, when we talk of the good old categories that we had, labor versus environment, they don't work anymore. They have never worked, but particularly now, they don't really work. They don't help us understand reality. There are so many political differentiations in both camps, and we need to understand them and work with them.
Stefania.
Oh, yes. I was gonna say.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I have one question, very simple, I think, so not very complicated. You mentioned at a certain point when you were discussing Chico Mendes and the Brazil and the Amazon case you worked with. So you mentioned interspecies commoning. So I wanted to ask two things. One, if you could say something more about the specific contribution of that struggle for the recognition of unwaged labor from Afro-descendant communities, indigenous people, mestizo people, and the riverine communities. And also, if you have time and patience, if you can expand a little bit on what you mean by interspecies commoning and what is the contribution for definition of labor.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, this is a very important, this is a point that is very dear to me because, of course, the story that I tell in chapter 4 of this book is the same story that also inspires the previous book, Forces of Reproduction. So for me, the story of subsistence workers in the Amazon region is key to understanding the potentialities, no? The political potentialities of unwaged labor as an agent of conservation, of grassroots conservation, of environmental defense, no? So the story goes like starts back in the mid-70s, and it starts with an alliance forming between the rural union, the Rubber Tappers Union, founded by Chico Mendes, and it was a traditional kind of union. These were waged workers working for the so-called rubber barons. So the landowners, the owners of the rubber forests that exploited these workers and to extract rubber in a way that was very detrimental to the health of the forest. And they started organizing as a traditional union. And then at some point, they started to realize, because they also lived in the forest, and they were also started to look at the indigenous communities that were there also. And started looking at not only their way of life, because the indigenous people were actually helping these workers to survive in the forest. They were teaching them a number of their knowledge on how to live in the forest and how to coexist with non-human nature in that particular environment, because the workers, the rubber tappers, were mostly coming from outside the Amazon. They were migrant workers coming from mostly from the northeast of Brazil, from the poor regions, the poorest regions, and they were kind of pushed into the Amazon to work for the rubber industry, and they didn't know how to survive. So they learned a lot from the indigenous communities, and they also learned another way of life that was not based on waged work. It was based on forms of subsistence work that were much more into coexisting with the forest and making a living out of the forest, non-timber forest products, as the literature now calls it. So what they called it la floresta in pe, no, the forest standing. So anything but cutting the trees. So there is so much that you can get from the forest once you make sure that the forest stays standing, alive, no, and well. So this subsistence work also implied taking care of the forest itself and protecting it from what? From the advancement of the commodity frontiers, from the advancement of the capitalist extractivism, no? And the advancement, for example, of the monocultures, of all sorts of monocultures, or timber extraction, or hydropower, or all kinds of business that would make the forest much more productive in terms of GDP. No, so the indigenous communities were at the same time protecting the forest and protecting their way of life, that was a way of life based on subsistence, non-unwaged work. And the rubber tappers realized that this was a possibility that they also wanted to join. So the importance of this struggle was that at the same time, the Brazilian state, the Brazilian government, was working on a land reform law, and they were proposing to the Brazilian workers to become land holders, no, to be assigned small land tenure in individual property, and they refused, no, because they understood that individual property was not what they wanted. They didn't want to become not only landowners, they were workers. They didn't want to become capitalists. They didn't want to become business owners, agrarian, going into the agro business. They wanted to just to live and subsist as workers, but free from the control, capitalist control. So I see this struggle, and that's when they allied with the indigenous people and formed this alliance of forest people. So I see in this case, this is why this case is so dear to me, because it really tells us so much on the potentialities and the otherness, no, and the fact that workers do not necessarily want to become capitalists, and this is the hope. This is a hope for humanity, no? That there are different ways of being human other than capital, and other than exploiting other people's work, other than extracting from the soil and non-human nature. And these possibilities have become, the fact that this struggle was successful is also very important. The fact that this struggle, even though it led to the killing of so many people, starting with Chico Mendes, but also going down throughout the 4 decades with so many other people that were killed for it, but still successful in the sense that it became law, and it has allowed to create this grassroots community agroforestry, and also you were mentioning rivering and other forms of conservation that are led by communities of subsistence workers making a living in this environment. Now, we don't need to romanticize all this. These people are have a very difficult life, and because they are surrounded by a lot of violence, both symbolic violence and also material violence, and also because their rights as Brazilian citizens are not always respected and acknowledged, and they don't have, there are so many amenities or even basic human rights that they don't have access to. And so that's why I think it's important to recognize them, not as activists, not as just social movements, but as workers, and recognize that these are workers in conservation, in subsistence and conservation work. They are doing important work in defending not only the Amazon forest, but a number of different ecosystems. They are doing important work in protecting these ecosystems, regenerating them, taking care of them, and these must be recognized as work. And so this is why they need to be supported by public policies, not just let them be, right? Not just allow them to exist, but recognize what they're doing is important work. That is important work for social and environmental reproduction.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that we are ready to close our meeting today. And maybe just a very quick remind that the next radical lecture will happen on June 25th, right? And it will be with Raul Zibeki, and it will be in Spanish actually. So something new for us. We will manage. And so thank you so much, Stefania, for being with us today.
Thank you.
Your lecture is now available on our YouTube channel, and we have been very lucky so far with so many people watching us, even mostly actually afterwards, reaching 1,800 viewers. We are really aiming for this 2,000, so I am sure that you will help us. And thank you so much. See you next time with Raul Zibeki. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Ciao, Marco.
Ciao and ciao.